Imagine a world where filling your car with petrol suddenly became a struggle. Lines stretched for kilometres outside service stations. Prices soar overnight. People panic buy. This was Australia in the mid 1970s during the global oil crisis, a moment that shook not just the world but fundamentally changed the way Australians drove, built, and thought about cars. Today, we're diving into the Australian oil crisis of the 1970s, what caused it, how it affected the automotive industry, and how government's response reshaped the industry forever. The oil crisis of the 1970s wasn't just an Australian problem, it was a global shock. The story begins in 1973 during the Yom Kippur War in the Middle East, when Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel. A major geopolitical upheaval ensued. In response, the Organisation of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OAPEC, a subset of the larger OPEC, decided to use oil as a weapon. They imposed an embargo on countries perceived as supporting Israel, including the United States and Western allies. Oil prices skyrocketed from roughly $3 per barrel to nearly $12 per barrel in a matter of months, a fourfold increase. The ripple effect was felt worldwide, including here in Australia, a nation reliant on both imported and domestic oil. Australia at the time produced about 70% of the oil it consumed, mainly from fields like Bass Strait. However, refining capacity was limited and global price surges still impacted supply chains. So when the embargo hit, petrol shortages emerged and Australians felt the pinch at the bowser. The immediate impact was chaos. Petrol stations imposed rationing in many cities. Motorists could only fill up once a week. Petrol prices rose sharply with an increase of around 25% or more in the following years. Cars were suddenly not just a convenience, they were a financial burden. The crisis also sparked a behavioural shift. Australians started carpooling. Public transport saw a resurgence. People began thinking about fuel efficiency in a way they had never done before. And for the automotive industry, this was a shockwave that couldn't be ignored. Prior to the oil crisis, Australian cars were large, powerful, and thirsty. Think the Ford Falcon, Holden Kingswood, and Chrysler Valiants. Vehicles designed with size and performance in mind, not fuel economy. Suddenly, these large six-cylinder and V8 engines were more expensive to run. Demand for smaller, more fuel-efficient vehicles began to rise, accelerating the popularity of imports from Japan, like the Datsun 120Y and the Toyota Corolla, which had already been gaining traction in the Australian market. Australians were forced to rethink what kind of car they wanted. The oil crisis hit Australian automakers hard. Holden, Ford Australia, and Chrysler Australia were caught off guard. Their production lines were built for big cars. Margins were squeezed as consumers shifted towards smaller, imported models. Ford, for example, had just launched the XA Falcon with V8 and six-cylinder engines. Initially, it was a hit, but suddenly, the economic reality of running a large Falcon in a high fuel price environment led to a shift in demand toward more fuel-efficient options. Holden's larger models faced similar challenges. This period also accelerated the import invasion. Japanese manufacturers who had mastered small, fuel-efficient cars started gaining serious traction in Australia. The Corolla, the Datsun 120Y, and the Toyota Crown became increasingly popular. By the late 1970s, these brands were no longer niche, they were mainstream. Domestic manufacturers had to adapt quickly. Ford and Holden began experimenting with smaller engine variants and more fuel-efficient models. Chrysler introduced the Centuria, a smaller sedan to compete with imports. The crisis marked a turning point. Australian manufacturers realised fuel efficiency could no longer be ignored. The Australian government also stepped in to help manage the crisis. In 1973 and 1974, under Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, the government implemented a series of measures to alleviate shortages and encourage fuel conservation. Rationing systems were prepared, though not fully enacted, along with price controls on petrol and campaigns that encouraged Australians to drive less, maintain their vehicles for efficiency, and adopt public transport when possible. The government also began promoting domestic oil exploration, including through the Petroleum and Minerals Authority Act of 1973, which aimed to enhance resource development, though it faced legal challenges. These measures gave authorities more control over the distribution and pricing of oil, aiming to ensure that Australia could better manage its energy supply in future crises. The Whitlam government's measures were continued and expanded under Malcolm Fraser in the late 1970s, with further encouragement of local exploration and refining. Some support, including policy nudges, was provided to encourage manufacturers to produce smaller, more fuel efficient cars domestically. The intervention fundamentally influenced the automotive industry. By promoting fuel efficient technologies and smaller vehicles, the government nudged manufacturers towards innovation, accelerating the development of Australian versions of compact cars, which had previously been largely ignored in favour of larger sedans. The oil crisis reshaped the Australian automotive landscape for decades. By the late 1970s, Holden and Ford were producing smaller, more fuel efficient models to compete with Japanese imports. Chrysler struggled, ultimately leading to Mitsubishi's acquisition of its operations starting in 1979 with full control by 1980. Consumer habits also shifted permanently. Fuel economy became a priority. The notion of a large V8 Australian family car being the default choice began to wane. And perhaps most importantly, the crisis exposed the vulnerability of Australia's reliance on imported oil and the need for domestic energy security, a lesson that shaped policy and industry strategies for years. In retrospect, the oil crisis forced the Australian automotive industry to evolve. It accelerated the acceptance of imported vehicles, prompted the domestic manufacturers to innovate, and reshaped the car market in ways that still echo today. The era of gas guzzling kings of the road began to give way to compact, efficient, and practical vehicles. And this transformation began with a crisis thousands of kilometres away. The 1970s oil crisis was a pivotal moment in Australian history. It was a stark reminder of how global events can ripple through local industries, reshape consumer behaviour, and force governments and businesses to adapt. For the Australian automotive industry, it was a wake up call, a test that ultimately led to innovation, efficiency, and a new way of thinking about cars. If you made it this far into the video, thanks for watching. Leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.